Hello guys, welcome back. Now today, we're going to talk about Paul Fenton and him getting fired as Minnesota Wild GM. After just 1 year being Minnesota Wild GM, Paul Fenton is out of a job and fired from Minnesota. So does he actually deserve to be fired so soon? And what is next for the Minnesota Wild? Watch till the end to find out. Paul Fenton has served as the Minnesota Wild GM for exactly 14 months now. Before that, he had a multiple of NHL jobs, most notably being the assistant GM behind David Poile of the Nashville Predators. And when it comes to being the GM being hired 14 months back, he was looking like a promising GM prospect. He was a guy that with Nashville had a pretty good track record, but as a GM with the Minnesota Wild, we got to see his full true colors. But they weren't exactly too good. And at first, I liked the idea of the Minnesota Wild going after Paul Fenton and trying to get a guy like that. He had so much success with the Nashville Predators, and rightfully so. But we got to see again all of what he was made of, and it wasn't that great. He made baffling move after confusing move. He made a couple of decent trades, a couple of decent moves, but for the most part, in 14 months, did a pretty terrible job. Alongside getting fired from the Minnesota Wild, Michael Russo of The Athletic, a guy that is on the Minnesota Wild 24/7, says that multiple employees throughout the Minnesota Wild organization were unhappy with not just the moves that Paul Fenton was making, but how he treated them and treated others in the organization. And when it comes to Paul Leopold, the owner of that team, he has started to build that culture since buying the team in 2008. It's seeming like from reports that Paul Fenton didn't respect that too much, or he didn't go by that too much, and that left a lot of other people mad as well. He wasn't even a great GM and a person off the ice, which is the double dagger, and that just says how good his time in Minnesota was, because it was not good whatsoever. And it seemed like, again, he didn't really respect that culture, respect the people there, which is a big no-no when you're trying to stay there long term. And Paul Fenton, obviously, I think wanted to do that. He kind of tried to rebuild a little bit, but go for free agency. I still don't know exactly what he was doing, because he would make rebuilding trades, like trying to trade Charlie Coyle, and then sign Matt Zuccarello to a 5-year deal. Honestly, whatever he did, for the most part, made zero sense, and getting fired in 14 months, while it doesn't usually happen, Paul Fenton is the lone exception, and kind of a good exception. Now, Michael Russo of The Athletic also reports that the GM search for Minnesota will start as of right now. It's now getting started. Right now, Tom Kurvers will be the interim GM for them. Won't be the long-term guy, but will serve as a GM for probably the next couple of weeks. And when it comes to the GM search, it's looking pretty hasty right now, like it will get done in the next couple of weeks. He also does report that they want to find a GM before the September 6th deadline of the prospect tournament in Traverse City. That's when they want to have their GM ready, a new GM ready to go. So we likely will get an announcement of a new GM probably in the next month at the most. Now, in Russo's article, we also got some pretty juicy details on the Zach Parise situation, a contract situation that's been pretty interesting the past couple of weeks. And Parise has kind of spilled out a little bit of information. There's been some rumors that he hasn't been completely happy with the Minnesota Wild, and that has been confirmed in his recent article. Zach Parise is saying that he was very unhappy with Paul Fenton and what he was managing with the Minnesota Wild, which is a big no-no. That's a guy that you want to have on board for your team. He was almost asking for a trade at that point, and that was very, very close. That likely also factored into the decision of firing Paul Fenton, getting that and done and over with. But Zach Parise, without Paul Fenton in Minnesota, likely is a much happier man. I'm going to go through some of Paul Fenton's moves in his 14-year stretch as Minnesota GM, starting with the one that, to me, I still don't understand at all what he was doing. The first big trade he made, Victor Rask for Nino Niederreiter. And as a Carolina Hurricanes fan, I really do like this trade quite a bit, but for the Minnesota Wild, it just did not work out whatsoever. Victor Rask, again, a guy that was injured, didn't really have too much consistently point-wise up to that point, and was even more garbage on the Minnesota Wild. Nino Niederreiter, on the other hand, was already fantastic defensively, and had some offensive punch, and with Carolina was an absolute beast alongside guys like Sebastian Aho. So we can put that as an L for the Minnesota Wild 100%. Next trade, that being Ryan Donato for Charlie Coyle, and I think this might be his only good move as GM for the Minnesota Wild, or at least the only big good move for them. But at the same time, they want to for some reason contend now. With Ryan Donato, if they wanted to contend, why didn't they just keep Charlie Coyle? Again, this just whole situation is kind of just baffling to me. And Ryan Donato, yes, played fantastic on Minnesota, but Charlie Coyle is a pretty good player too. Signing Matt Zuccarello, though, and training a guy like Charlie Coyle, to me makes no sense, even if Ryan Donato is still a freaking awesome player. For the next confusing trade, we have the Kevin Fiala for Mikael Granlund trade, the one that happened a couple of minutes before the trade deadline ended up ending. And again, this trade is another one that I'm like, I don't even know what's going on here in Minnesota. Kevin Fiala, yes, is younger, has some amazing talent, but Mikael Granlund was a leader for Minnesota for a long, long time, and points-wise was in his prime at that point. Yes, didn't do all that great with Nashville, but is still a pretty good player at that. And Kevin Fiala is a decent player, but that trade to me 1-for-1 still right now is a joke. And then we got the last one. This one coming in free agency, and as a Dallas Stars fan, I can totally say this was a big mistake for the Minnesota Wild. That being the Matt Zuccarello contract. 6 years at $5 million. Big mistake for the Minnesota Wild. And when it comes to Dallas, they didn't want to give him that 5th year. They might have gone and given him $6 million at 4 years, but that 5th year was a big problem. Minnesota came up in free agency and was able to give it to him, had some cap space left, and Paul Fenton being the idiot that he was at that point, signed Matt Zuccarello to that contract. And Zuccarello is a great player. I love Matt Zuccarello. But at $6 million for 5 more years when he turns like 37 or something, I don't want to have that type of contract on my team. And for the Minnesota Wild, a team that with this new GM will likely go in a more rebuilding route, to have Matt Zuccarello there is a little bit of an ouch. For the Minnesota Wild to own up to their mistake and fire Paul Fenton, I think is a ballsy move, but a move that I think for Minnesota needed to actually happen. Paul Fenton at this point was looking like a top 5 worst GM in the league. At that point, his track record was already looking terrible, and Minnesota pulling the plug, I honestly don't blame them whatsoever. For what he did in his short stint was so incredibly bad. Almost every single move just seeming to backfire on them and backfire on them and backfire every single time. It starts to add up a lot more, and Leopold, the owner of the Minnesota Wild, obviously saw that, saw his own mistake, and took the chance to correct it, which I definitely applaud them for, because the franchise is in a much better direction now that Fenton is gone. If those reports are true that he's a terrible person off the ice, then he's a terrible GM and a terrible person. And at that point, I don't really feel bad for him whatsoever. And again, 1 year as an NHL GM, that's pretty terrible. And if he's that bad of a person that multiple people are complaining about him, I think it's a good move for the Minnesota Wild. But of course, with this video, I need to hear your guys' thoughts down in those comments down below. So let me know what you think about the Minnesota Wild firing their 1-year GM Paul Fenton. Do you think this is a good move or a bad move? And what do you think about Minnesota? What do you think they do next? If you guys want some more Grav videos just like this one, you can click on this card right here to watch my video on Nikita Gusev and him being traded to the New Jersey Devils. But that'll be it for today, guys. If you guys did enjoy, make sure to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit that notification bell if you haven't already. Again, comment down below your thoughts on Paul Fenton being fired as GM. Do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? Let me know. And I will see you guys in the next video or stream. Goodbye.